Mafia Boss sees his maid eating in the rain. What he discovers breaks his heart. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The rain came down in sheets, heavy and relentless, as if the sky itself was grieving. Beneath the torrent, a solitary figure huddled beneath the awning of a small, run-down building. The maid, dressed in a simple uniform, sat on the cold concrete, her hands trembling as she tore a piece of bread. She wasn't eating for enjoyment. She wasn't eating for comfort. She was eating because she had to. The bread was hard, stale, barely enough to fill the hunger gnawing at her insides. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing floors in the mansion all day. But it wasn't the cold or the hunger that made her feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. It was the fact that she wasn't allowed to eat inside. She had been banished, not by words, but by the cold indifference of the mansion's rules. The mafia boss's wife had made it clear. The staff ate in the kitchen, not in the lavish dining rooms where the family and guests enjoyed gourmet meals. As the minutes passed, her gaze drifted to the large windows of the mansion, just visible in the distance. Warm light spilled out, casting long shadows on the rain-soaked ground. She imagined the family, seated comfortably around the table, laughing, enjoying their meal. But here she was, an outsider, forced to sit in the cold, her meal nothing more than scraps from a life she had no part in. It wasn't the first time. She had endured worse, the snide remarks, the dismissive glances, the way they all ignored her like she didn't even exist. But tonight, it stung more than usual. The rain had soaked through her thin uniform, and her body ached with exhaustion. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly warm. But she didn't complain. She never complained. Complaining would only make it worse. Her eyes, red from the sting of the wind and the chill in her bones, stared at the mansion's lights as if they were the only source of warmth in the world. And then, out of nowhere, a shadow crossed in front of her. Startled, she looked up, her heart racing. There, standing just outside the shelter, was the mafia boss. He was dressed in his usual dark, tailored suit, his sharp features barely illuminated by the streetlights. His expression was unreadable as he looked down at her, the rain dripping from his coat. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice low, carrying a note of surprise. She froze, caught between embarrassment and the overwhelming desire to shrink back into the shadows. "I was just eating, sir," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her for a moment, taking in her hunched figure, the way she shivered in the cold. Without a word, he stepped forward, his shoes crunching against the wet pavement. For a brief moment, she thought he might scold her, might send her back inside. But then, to her surprise, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a large, folded coat. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "You're freezing." She blinked, unsure of what was happening. The mafia boss, the man who ruled the city with a cold, ruthless hand, was offering her his coat. The same man who had never once looked at her with anything other than indifference. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the coat, not knowing how to respond. "Take it," he repeated, his voice softening slightly. "It's the least I can do." She took the coat, her fingers brushing against his hand, and for a moment, she forgot about the rain, forgot about the hunger, forgot about the pain. It wasn't much, just a coat, just a simple act of kindness. But in that moment, it was everything. As she slipped the coat on, she couldn't help but feel a strange warmth spreading through her chest. The mafia boss stood there for a moment longer, watching her, before turning away and heading back to the mansion. But before he disappeared into the night, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with something more than indifference, something soft, something that almost looked like empathy. She stood there, stunned, as the rain continued to fall, the coat wrapped tightly around her, offering her more comfort than she had felt in years. What had just happened? And more importantly, why had he done it? The next morning, the mansion felt different. The cold, persistent rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with humidity and the scent of wet earth. Inside, the house was as luxurious as ever, with sunlight filtering through tall windows and casting soft beams of light on the polished floors. Yet, despite the grandeur, there was a strange shift in the atmosphere, something subtle, something almost human. The maid, Maria, woke early, as usual. Her body ached from the long hours of work the day before, but there was a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't quite place it, but the warmth of the coat from the night before still lingered in her mind. It wasn't just the coat, it was the gesture. She hadn't expected it. It had caught her off guard. The Mafia Boss, the man who ruled this house, had shown her kindness. He didn't have to. He could have ignored her, continued to let her sit outside in the cold. But he hadn't. The memory of his words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, take it. It's the least I can do. Asterisk, she folded the coat carefully and placed it in her room before heading to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As she worked, her mind wandered. What did it mean? Why had he done it? He was powerful, untouchable, even. People feared him. But his actions last night, those weren't the actions of a man who saw people as tools, as mere objects to use and discard. The sound of footsteps brought her back to reality. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his dark suit impeccable as always, his eyes scanning the room with that familiar, calculating gaze. "You're up early," he said, his voice smooth, but there was a hint of something she couldn't quite identify. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts in her head. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her. "I trust you're doing well?" he asked, and for a moment, it almost sounded like he genuinely cared. She nodded again. "Yes, thank you. I'm fine." He paused, then stepped into the room, his presence commanding. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, his tone different from usual, less cold, more direct. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. "About last night," he continued, his gaze never leaving her. "You didn't have to accept the coat. I was out of line." His words were unexpected, and they caught her off guard. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It was kind of you. I appreciated it." His expression softened, just for a moment. "It wasn't right," he repeated. "I didn't realize how much you've been overlooked." She looked down, unsure how to respond. "You shouldn't be treated that way," he added, his voice lower now. "It's not fair." Maria swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm used to it," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's part of the job." He shook his head, stepping closer. "It shouldn't be," he said firmly. For a brief, fleeting moment, Maria saw something in his eyes, something that almost resembled regret. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that familiar, unreadable mask. He took a deep breath, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, he spoke. "I want to make it right. Starting today." Maria blinked, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're not just the help, Maria. You're more than that. I want you to know that." The words hung in the air between them, leaving Maria momentarily speechless. For a long time, she had been invisible to everyone in this mansion, an object, a shadow, a servant. But now, in this moment, it felt like something was changing. The silence stretched between them, neither of them moving. "Thank you," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. He nodded, his expression softening, before turning to leave. "I'll see you at dinner," he said, his tone returning to its usual businesslike edge. But before he left, he paused in the doorway and looked back at her. "Maria," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't have to stay in the shadows anymore." And with that, he was gone. Maria stood there, frozen for a moment, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had he really meant what he said? She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to feel. But then, a small part of her dared to hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Dinner that night was different. The atmosphere was still tense, as always, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The Mafia Boss sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence filling the room. But now, when his eyes flickered over to her, there was something more in his gaze, something that made her heart beat a little faster. He hadn't looked at her like that before. As she served the food, she noticed that his eyes followed her movements more closely than usual. She tried to ignore the flutter in her chest, but it was hard. His gaze was intense, his focus unwavering. But it wasn't threatening. It wasn't the way he looked at everyone else. It was different. After the meal, as the guests began to file out, he approached her again. This time, his steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Maria," he said quietly, his voice just above a whisper. "You're doing a good job." It was a simple compliment, but it meant more than anything she had heard in a long time. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. He gave a small nod, and with that, he turned and left the room. But as he walked away, something inside Maria shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just a maid. And maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The following days passed quietly, but there was a change in the air, subtle yet undeniable. Maria noticed it most during the early mornings when she would prepare breakfast in the kitchen. The atmosphere felt different, lighter somehow. She wasn't sure if it was because of the coat or the words the Mafia Boss had said to her, but it seemed like the house was filled with an energy that hadn't been there before. As she carried out her duties, she found herself stealing glances at him more often than usual. He, too, seemed to watch her, though his gaze was no longer cold or dismissive. Now, when their eyes met, there was a softness in his expression, a flicker of something more than the usual indifference. It confused her, and it made her heart race in a way she hadn't expected. One evening, as she was clearing the dinner table, the Mafia Boss approached her again. She hadn't expected him, but when she saw him standing there, his presence was magnetic. He stood just a few feet away, watching her, as he had been doing for days now. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and she could feel the tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart pounding in her chest. "Maria," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking." She looked up at him, surprised at the sudden seriousness in his tone. "About what, sir?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He shook his head, almost as if he were uncertain. "It's not about the job," he said after a pause. "It's about how things have been, how I've treated you." Maria swallowed, not knowing how to respond. He was the Mafia Boss. He could have anyone do anything for him at any time. She had always been invisible to him, just a maid in his house. But now, his words felt like a turning point, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped a little closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly. "But I want you to know that things will be different from now on. I've been wrong." The words hung in the air like a weight, and Maria found herself struggling to understand what was happening. The man who had ruled this house with an iron fist was now admitting that he had been wrong about her, about how he had treated her. She couldn't help but wonder if she had heard him correctly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he continued, his voice steady now. "But I will make things right. You deserve better than this. You deserve more than being treated like." He stopped himself, his jaw tightening as if the words were difficult to say. "Like a servant," Maria finished for him, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded, his expression softening. "Yes," he said. "I've treated you like that for far too long. And I'm sorry." Maria could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. Was this really happening? The Mafia Boss, the man who had seemed so distant, so unapproachable, was apologizing to her? "You don't have to apologize," she said quickly, not wanting him to feel uncomfortable. "It's my job." "It's more than just a job," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of sincerity. "You're a person, Maria. I've treated you like less than that, and that's something I regret." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, she found herself lost for words. She had never imagined she would hear such things from him. The Mafia Boss, who everyone feared, who commanded respect, was now standing in front of her, vulnerable in a way she had never thought possible. "I've made arrangements," he continued, breaking the silence. "From now on, you won't work the late shifts. You won't be forced to do anything outside of what you're comfortable with." Maria blinked, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, confused. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke with quiet determination. "I've spoken to my staff," he said, "and I've decided that you'll have more freedom. I'm not going to treat you like an outsider anymore." Maria felt a lump form in her throat, but she fought to keep it together. This was too much to process all at once. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she even believed what she was hearing. He gave a small nod, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's the least I can do," he said. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't the oppressive silence she had grown used to. It felt lighter, almost like a new beginning. As the Mafia boss turned to leave, he stopped at the door and glanced back at her. "Maria," he said, his voice softer now. "I hope you know that this isn't just about making things right. It's about me seeing you for who you really are. You're not invisible to me anymore." With that, he left, his footsteps fading down the hall. Maria stood in the middle of the room, her mind racing, her heart still pounding in her chest. The man who had been a figure of power and authority in her life had just changed everything. And as she stood there, trying to make sense of it all, one thought kept repeating in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to change. The days that followed felt surreal to Maria. For the first time in her life, she began to feel seen, truly seen, by someone who held power over her world. The Mafia boss had made it clear that things were changing, but she didn't quite know how to adjust. His words replayed in her mind over and over, and though they should have filled her with relief, they only created a sense of uncertainty. Could this really be happening? Could she really expect to be treated as something more than just the maid, just an invisible figure in the mansion? The morning after his promise, Maria stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as usual. Her hands moved mechanically, the familiarity of the tasks grounding her, but her mind kept drifting back to him. How different he had been, how different this all was. She had grown used to being ignored, used to being invisible. But now, with each passing day, she could feel the shift. And she couldn't tell whether it was a good thing or if it was something she wasn't prepared for. As she laid out the dishes, she heard footsteps approaching, and instinctively, she straightened up. She had not been expecting him. She turned to find the Mafia boss standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his dark suit neatly pressed, as usual. His presence filled the room, but this time, it didn't feel as suffocating. Instead, it felt almost comforting. "Good morning, Maria," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight she wasn't used to hearing. "Morning, sir," she replied, keeping her tone even, trying to maintain the distance she had always kept. She had worked here for years, and she had learned that when someone like him spoke, you didn't show too much emotion. It could be a dangerous thing. He didn't seem to mind, though. He stepped further into the room, not with the usual coldness that accompanied his presence, but with something different, something softer. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said, his tone more casual than before. Maria looked up, surprised. He wasn't one for casual conversations. "About what, sir?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of curiosity. "About you," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "And how you're doing. I've been thinking about what I said the other day, and I want to make sure you know I'm serious about these changes." Maria felt a tightness in her chest. Was he really going to follow through with this? Could she really trust him? "I appreciate that, sir," she said, unsure of what else to add. He looked at her for a moment, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "Maria," he said softly, "I don't want to be like the others. I don't want you to feel like you're just a servant. I want you to feel valued." Maria didn't know what to say. She had spent so long in this house, so long trying to remain invisible, that hearing someone like him say something like that was almost too much to process. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly, lowering her eyes to the countertop. "It's more than just a job," he said firmly. "I've seen the way you work. You deserve more than this." He paused, taking a step closer to her. "You deserve respect." His words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, she could feel tears threatening to rise. She quickly blinked them away, not wanting him to see the vulnerability he had unlocked with just a few words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "But I mean it, Maria. You're important. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." She stood there, rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. This man, this Mafia boss, had just told her that she was important. And for the first time in years, Maria actually believed it. But as much as she wanted to embrace the kindness he was offering, she couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. What did this all mean? Why was he suddenly treating her this way? And more importantly, what would happen next? As the silence stretched between them, the tension seemed to dissolve, and for the first time, Maria felt like she wasn't just someone who cleaned the mansion. She wasn't just the invisible maid. She was a person worthy of respect. But before she could say anything else, the Mafia boss turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly in the hallway. "I'll see you at dinner," he said over his shoulder, his voice still carrying that same weight, but with a touch of something gentler, something warmer. Maria nodded, unsure of what to say or do next. As he walked away, she stood there in the kitchen, still processing everything that had just happened. This wasn't just a simple gesture of kindness. It felt like something much more significant. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that things might be different from now on. As she finished her tasks and prepared for dinner that evening, she couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. Was this the beginning of something new? Or was it just another fleeting moment in a life defined by invisibility? The Mafia boss's actions had given her hope, but hope was a dangerous thing, especially in a world like theirs. Maria had learned to survive on her own, but now, she was beginning to wonder if she could finally allow herself to trust him. And, more importantly, trust the change he was promising. The days that followed were a whirlwind of unexpected changes. Maria found herself navigating the mansion in a way she never had before, less as a servant and more as someone who belonged. The Mafia boss's words replayed in her mind constantly. Asterisk, you deserve respect. Asterisk, and every time she thought of them, she felt a rush of warmth, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in ages, she felt seen, truly seen. Yet, with that new sense of recognition came a sense of unease. How much of this kindness was real? Was he really changing? Or was it just a fleeting moment of generosity that would soon fade? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him, though. His actions had been genuine. The way he treated her had been nothing short of kind. And every time he spoke to her, it felt like he was peeling away the layers of coldness he had built around himself. That night, as she prepared for dinner, she found herself anxiously awaiting his arrival. It was the first time they would be in the same room since their conversation in the kitchen. She wasn't sure what to expect. The man who had been cold and distant for so long was now someone who had shown her a surprising amount of compassion. As she set the table, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Maria's heart skipped a beat as the door to the dining room opened, and there he was, dressed in his usual dark, tailored suit, his dark eyes scanning the room before they landed on her. "Maria," he said softly, his tone warm yet commanding. "I hope you're doing well." She smiled faintly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I am, sir. Thank you for asking." He nodded, stepping further into the room. "Good," he said, his voice steady. He took his seat at the head of the table, as usual, but this time, there was something different about him. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than it normally would, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of uncertainty. Was he waiting for something? "Maria," he said again, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "I've been thinking." She looked up from her work, meeting his eyes. "About what, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. "About how things have been," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "And about how I've treated you. I want to make sure you know that things are changing. They have to change." Maria's heart raced, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. The words he was saying were unexpected, but they were also exactly what she had been hoping for. She had spent so many years in this mansion, so many years feeling invisible, that hearing him speak this way was overwhelming. "I don't want you to feel like you're just a maid anymore," he continued, his tone firm. "I want you to know that I see you. You're not just an employee to me. You're someone who deserves respect. Someone who matters." His words hit her with the force of a revelation. She had never expected to hear such things from him. The man who had ruled this mansion with an iron fist, the man who had looked through her as though she were invisible, was now speaking to her like she was a person. And as much as she wanted to believe him, she couldn't help but feel a wave of skepticism. Was this real? Or was he just trying to placate her? She couldn't tell. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "It's just the truth." He paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to something distant, something that Maria couldn't quite place. I know I've been distant, he said finally, his voice steady again. And I know I've treated you like you didn't matter. But I'm going to change that. From now on, you won't be treated like the help. You'll be treated with the respect you deserve. Maria nodded, unsure of what to say. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could really change. But a part of her was afraid. Afraid of getting her hopes up only to have them dashed. Afraid of trusting someone who had hurt her before. As the evening went on, the dinner passed in a blur. She found herself stealing glances at him throughout the meal, trying to read his expression, trying to figure out what was really going on inside his mind. He was still the same man, the powerful, intimidating mafia boss who had built an empire on fear and respect. But now, there was something else there, something softer, something more human. As the meal came to an end, he rose from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Maria, he said, turning to face her one last time that night. I want you to know that this is just the beginning. There will be more changes. And I'll make sure they happen. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. For the first time, she saw a promise in his eyes. And as he left the room, a small part of her believed that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to trust it. The next few days unfolded like a dream Maria wasn't sure she was ready to believe. With each passing moment, the mafia boss's words, asterisk, you deserve respect, asterisk, echoed in her mind. But even more so, the quiet, sincere changes in his behavior gave her a sense of unease. He hadn't just said the words. He was proving them. Every interaction, every brief glance, every word spoken carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just kindness, it was a shift. A real, tangible shift. That night, after dinner, Maria stood at the window of the mansion's grand hallway, watching the dark, quiet streets below. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't before, though the rooms were filled with people, staff, and activity. The mansion, once a prison of isolation, now seemed to be holding something. Hope. She turned away from the window as the sound of footsteps grew closer. She knew who it was before she even looked. The familiar, commanding presence of the mafia boss filled the space behind her. Maria, he said, his voice smooth but not as cold as it used to be. She glanced over her shoulder, startled by the sudden presence. Yes, sir, she replied, keeping her voice calm, though her heart was racing. I've been thinking about the changes I mentioned, he said, stepping closer to her. And I wanted to let you know that there are more things I'm planning. Things that will affect everyone in this house, not just you. Maria's curiosity piqued, but she held her ground, unsure what he was alluding to. She had never imagined he would think beyond his immediate circle. What do you mean? She asked, careful not to sound too eager. He paused for a moment, looking out the window for a beat before his gaze shifted back to her. I'm making changes to the way this place runs. You won't be the only one who sees a difference. I'm moving people around, offering them more freedom, more respect, he explained, his voice holding an undertone of something she couldn't place. Maria's mind raced. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a complete overhaul of the dynamics within the mansion. I understand, she said slowly, her mind grappling with the enormity of what he was implying. You're giving them more freedom? She couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and skepticism. It's time, he said simply, his gaze steady. People here have been living under rigid rules for far too long. They've earned more than the fear and the control I've given them. I want them to feel like they matter, like they are more than just employees. She stood there, processing his words. In all her years working in this mansion, Maria had never imagined hearing someone like him say such things, especially not about the people who worked beneath him. The mafia boss, known for his ruthless control and unshakable authority, was talking about empathy, about respect. She wasn't sure how to react, but she felt a growing sense of admiration for the man who was trying so hard to change. And what about me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You're part of this change too, Maria, he said, his tone soft but unwavering. I told you before that you deserve more than this. I meant it. I'm going to make sure you are respected in this house, that you aren't just seen as the maid anymore. You're going to be treated as a person. Maria felt her heart flutter at his words, but she quickly squashed the feeling. She didn't know if she could trust him fully, not yet. But his sincerity was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just making empty promises, he was acting on them. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady, but her heart was racing. "But I don't want special treatment. I just want to be treated fairly." The Mafia boss looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "That's exactly what I'm offering you, Maria," he said quietly. "Fairness. Nothing more, nothing less." He stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. "Things are going to be different, and I want you to be a part of that. I've already started making changes. We're going to give people in this house more autonomy, more control over their lives." Maria felt a mix of emotions swirl within her. She had been a part of this mansion's rigid, controlled system for so long that hearing about these changes made her both hopeful and uncertain. But something inside her urged her to trust him, to trust this shift. "I don't know what to say," she said quietly. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "Just know that I meant what I said. I see you, Maria, and I won't forget it." As he turned to leave, she stood frozen in place, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The man who had once intimidated her beyond measure, the man who had kept everyone under his control, was now speaking of equality, of respect. Could it be real? Could he really change? She wasn't sure, but for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The house that had once been a place of isolation was now beginning to feel like it could be a home, a place where people were seen, a place where they mattered. And as Maria walked down the hall to prepare for the next day, she felt a lightness in her chest, a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe this time, the change would stick. The days that followed were filled with a sense of quiet anticipation, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Maria couldn't quite explain it, but everything felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted. The once oppressive silence of the house was now filled with a subtle hum of possibility. She could feel it in the way people moved through the hallways, in the way the staff no longer hesitated before speaking, no longer shrinking under the weight of invisible eyes. And for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a ghost in this house. She was a person. She had a voice. That night, as the clock struck 8 and the dinner bell rang, Maria found herself preparing for a meal that would feel unlike any other. The Mafia boss had insisted on a smaller, more intimate dinner. There would be no guests, no formalities, just the family and the staff. It was a strange request, but somehow it felt right. She worked quickly, setting the table, ensuring everything was perfect. She had grown used to this routine, but tonight, there was something different in the air. As she placed the final dish on the table, she noticed him standing at the entrance to the dining room. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, but there was something in his posture that caught her attention. He wasn't the same man she had met when she first arrived at the mansion. He stood taller, his presence no longer looming but instead commanding in a way that felt reassuring. He caught her eye as she turned, and for a moment, their gazes locked. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Tonight, we're doing things differently. I want you to sit with us." She froze, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Sit with you, sir?" she asked, her voice a little shakier than she intended. "Yes," he said with a small nod. "You've earned a place at the table, Maria. You're not just here to serve. You're part of this family now." The words hung in the air, and Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined hearing anything like that from him, especially not in the context of this mansion. She had spent years serving him and his family, always in the background, always invisible. But now, he was telling her that she was more than that. She wasn't sure what to say. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her mind racing. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, stepping further into the room. "Just know that you belong here." His words, so simple, yet so powerful, struck something deep inside her. For years, she had felt like an outsider, a mere employee in a house filled with wealth and power. But now, in this moment, something was shifting. Something she hadn't dared to hope for was finally becoming real. Maria nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He gave a small smile before turning toward the table. "Let's eat," he said. And as they all sat down, Maria found herself at the head of the table, not as a servant, but as an equal. The meal was simple, but there was a warmth in the air that Maria had never experienced in this mansion. They talked about everything and nothing, about the changes in the house, about the future, about the things they had all been through. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something. As the evening wore on, Maria couldn't help but notice the way the Mafia boss looked at her now. It wasn't with the same cold, distant gaze he had always had. There was something more, something that suggested that maybe, just maybe, he saw her in a way he hadn't before. As the dinner wound down, he stood up, his eyes meeting hers once again. "Maria," he said, his voice low and sincere, "this is just the beginning. I want you to know that things are changing. Not just for you, but for everyone in this house. I'm not going to let the past define us anymore. We're moving forward." She smiled. A small but genuine smile. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had a place in it. A real place. Not just as a maid or an employee, but as someone who mattered. As the evening came to a close and the last of the plates were cleared, Maria lingered in the kitchen, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened. She had always thought that the Mafia boss was someone beyond reach, someone she could never understand. But now, as she stood in this empty kitchen, alone with her thoughts, she realized that he was just a man. A man who had made mistakes, just like everyone else. And maybe, just maybe, he was trying to make things right. As she washed the last of the dishes, Maria felt a flicker of hope in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to see it. She was ready to see where this new beginning would take her. The following weeks were a blur for Maria. Each day seemed to blend into the next, but the feeling of change in the mansion remained ever present. The atmosphere had shifted so much that it was impossible to ignore. She was no longer just a maid, no longer just a shadow in the corners of the house. With each passing day, she was becoming more a part of something that she had once believed to be beyond her reach. The Mafia boss's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "You're not just here to serve. You're part of this family now." Asterisk, and as she walked through the grand hallways, carrying out her duties, she felt it. She was part of this world, not just as an observer, but as someone who mattered. But with this newfound sense of belonging came a growing unease. She still couldn't fully understand the extent of the Mafia boss's transformation. He had been so distant, so cold for so long, and now, he was offering her respect. She wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that he had truly changed. But something in the back of her mind kept asking, what if this was just a fleeting moment? What if, like everything else in her life, it would all come crashing down? As the days wore on, Maria found herself becoming more aware of the subtle changes in the mansion. The staff, once so reserved, were beginning to open up to one another. There was less fear in their eyes, less anxiety in their movements. And even the Mafia boss, who had once commanded the room with unshakable authority, seemed lighter. He still had the same presence, the same unspoken power, but there was something different about him now. It wasn't just the way he treated her, it was the way he treated everyone. He spoke with them now, not as a leader issuing orders, but as a man who genuinely cared about their well-being. That evening, as Maria finished her duties, she was surprised to hear a knock on the kitchen door. She turned to find the Mafia boss standing there, his expression unreadable as usual, but there was something softer in his eyes. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but kind. "I need to talk to you for a moment." She felt her heart skip a beat. She had gotten used to the idea of him as a figure of authority, but lately, there was something in his presence that made her nervous, something unfamiliar. "Of course, sir," she replied, setting down the dish she was holding and wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been watching how things have been going here," he said, pausing as if carefully choosing his words. "I've made a lot of changes, and I want to make sure you know that I'm not done. There's more to come." Maria frowned, trying to read his expression. "What do you mean, sir?" she asked. He smiled faintly, though it wasn't the usual cold smile she had seen so many times before. This one was warmer, almost genuine. "I'm making sure that everyone here is treated with the respect they deserve," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You included." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had never imagined hearing him speak like this. Never thought that the man who had once kept her hidden in the shadows would one day tell her she deserved respect. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "It's long overdue," he said simply, his eyes softening. But there's one thing I want you to understand, Maria. This is not just about me being kind. This is about me understanding. Understanding what it means to be treated as a person, not as a servant. And I want you to know that I will always see you for who you really are from now on. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Maria felt a warmth in her chest. It wasn't just his actions. It was the sincerity in his voice, the conviction behind his words. She had spent so long in this house, so long feeling invisible, that hearing him speak like this felt almost surreal. She didn't know what to say. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to," he replied, his gaze softening further. "You don't have to thank me for doing what's right." Maria smiled faintly, still unsure of what to feel. "You've already done more than enough, sir," she said quietly. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm not just offering you respect, Maria," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm offering you a choice. A chance to live here on your own terms. To do what you want, without fear, without worry. To have a voice." Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. Could this really be happening? Could he really be offering her freedom? The idea seemed impossible, like something she had only dared to dream about. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw that this wasn't a dream. This was real. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right," he added. "And I'll make sure you have the space you need to live your life the way you want. You don't have to be a maid forever, Maria. You can be so much more than that." Maria stood there in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change was truly possible. She wasn't just a servant. She wasn't just invisible. She was someone who mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally start living her own life. As the evening went on, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. Things were changing. No, they had already changed. And she, too, was changing. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The change that Maria had felt over the past few weeks was undeniable, but even now, standing in the grand hallway of the mansion, she couldn't fully understand the extent of it. The world around her had shifted, and she had begun to see herself differently, but so had everyone else. The staff, once afraid to speak up or express anything other than obedience, now walked with their heads held a little higher. The Mafia Boss's actions were not just about her. They were about everyone. People were beginning to feel a sense of dignity they had never had before. And yet, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. There was still a wall, something between her and him that she couldn't quite break through. The vulnerability that she had seen in his eyes the first time they spoke about change had started to fade, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze that Maria had known for so long. It wasn't that he had reverted to his old ways, but there was something different now, something guarded, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it. That evening, as she set the dinner table, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. The air always seemed to change when he was near, as if the world tilted slightly in his presence. "Maria," he said, his voice steady as always, but this time, there was something in it that made her stomach flip. She turned around to face him, trying to read the expression on his face. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice steady, though she felt the familiar nervous flutter in her chest. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze piercing, but there was something softer about it this time, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking," he began, and Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Thinking. He always had that serious tone when he was about to make a decision, and Maria couldn't help but wonder what he was planning now. "About the way things are," he continued, his voice quieter than usual. "About the changes I've made here." Maria nodded, waiting for him to continue. She didn't want to interrupt, but her mind raced. She had seen the subtle shifts in the staff, felt the change in how people treated one another. She had begun to hope that this transformation wasn't just a temporary gesture. "And what about it?" she asked, cautiously, unsure if she wanted to hear what he was going to say next. The Mafia Boss's eyes softened, but just slightly. "I wanted to make sure you knew that I meant what I said," he replied, his voice firm, yet oddly vulnerable. "You matter, Maria. You're not just someone who works here. You've earned my respect." She didn't know how to respond at first. The words he spoke were simple, but they carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. She had worked so hard for so long in this house, always behind the scenes, always invisible. And now, for the first time, she was being seen. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, almost unsure of whether she was allowed to feel this grateful. He nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "It's the least I can do," he said. "But I need you to know something. I need you to understand that this—" He paused, clearly searching for the right words. "This respect, this change, it's not just for you. It's for everyone in this house. But it starts with you." Maria looked at him, trying to understand. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but she could sense that something important was coming. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Mafia Boss sighed, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said that day, when you said you didn't want special treatment." His voice softened, but there was a firmness behind it that made Maria's heart race. "You're not getting special treatment, Maria. What you're getting is fairness. And I want you to know that I'm going to make sure everyone here is treated fairly. But I need you to help me do that." She blinked, surprised by his words. "Help you?" she repeated, not fully understanding. "Yes," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You've been here the longest. You know the ins and outs of this place better than anyone. And I need you to be the one who helps lead this change. You're more than just someone who serves meals and cleans rooms. You're someone who knows what it feels like to be invisible. And I need you to help me make sure no one feels like that again." Maria stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just being asked to do her job. She was being asked to be a part of something bigger, something she hadn't imagined in her wildest dreams. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her throat tight. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said softly. "But I want you to think about it. Think about what it means to be part of this change, to have a voice in it." Maria nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had spent so many years in this mansion, following orders, staying out of the way, keeping her head down. Now, the Mafia Boss was asking her to be more than that. He was asking her to lead, to help change the very structure of the mansion. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door and looked back at her. "Maria," he said quietly, "I know this isn't easy, but you're not alone in this. I'm with you. We're in this together." And with that, he left the room, leaving Maria standing there, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to find out. The next few days were filled with uncertainty and anticipation. Maria had been asked to help lead the changes in the mansion, but what did that really mean? She was still adjusting to the idea of not being invisible, of not just being the maid, but a person with a voice, a person who could make a difference. Every time she walked through the halls of the mansion, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had been given. But with that weight also came a sense of purpose. She was no longer just following orders. Now, she was helping to shape the future of the house. The staff, too, had begun to change. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of how to react to the sudden shift in the power dynamics. But as time went on, they began to speak more openly to one another, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the new changes. The Mafia Boss's presence, once so commanding, had become less intimidating. He was still the same powerful figure, but now, he was approachable, someone who genuinely listened, who genuinely cared. As Maria adjusted to her new role, she found herself spending more time with him. He would ask her opinions on various matters, not just related to the house, but on how things should be done, how people should be treated. She was no longer just following orders. She was a part of the decision-making process. And it felt good. One evening, as the two of them sat in his office, discussing the progress of the changes, Maria couldn't help but notice how different the Mafia Boss seemed. Gone was the cold, distant leader she had once feared. In his place was someone who was more human, more open, and more vulnerable. He was still the man who ran the empire, still the man who had earned his reputation, but he was no longer hiding behind walls of indifference. "Maria," he said, his voice steady, but softer than usual. "I need to know if I'm doing the right thing." She looked up from the paperwork in front of her, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "What do you mean, sir?" she asked, her tone cautious. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together as he stared at the ceiling. "I've been thinking a lot about what I've done, about the changes I've made, and I wonder if it's enough. If I'm really doing enough for the people in this house." Maria studied him for a moment, wondering if she had heard him correctly. The Mafia Boss, The man who had always been so confident, so certain in his actions, was questioning himself. It was a strange thing to witness, but it also made her realize just how much he had changed. "I think you're doing the right thing," she said slowly, trying to find the right words. "But it's not just about making changes. It's about consistency. It's about showing everyone that these changes are real, that they're not just temporary." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're right," he said. "I can't just make changes and expect everyone to believe in them overnight. I need to show them. I need to prove to them that this is who I am now." Maria felt a wave of understanding wash over her. She had seen the way he had started to treat people differently, but now she realized that he was still in the process of changing himself. It wasn't just about making others believe in him. It was about him believing in himself. "You've already made a huge difference," she said, her voice steady. "You've already shown everyone that things can be different, and that's more than enough." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. The Mafia boss looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge whether she truly believed what she was saying. And then, as if coming to a decision, he nodded. "Thank you, Maria," he said quietly. "Your words mean more to me than you know." She smiled faintly, unsure of how to respond, but her heart swelled with a strange mix of pride and gratitude. This man, who had once been an enigma to her, was now someone she could understand. He was no longer just the Mafia boss. He was someone who was capable of change, of growth. And that realization brought her a sense of hope. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of progress. The changes in the mansion were becoming more tangible, more visible. The staff were starting to trust the process, starting to trust that things were genuinely changing for the better. Maria found herself in more meetings, more discussions with the Mafia boss, and the more they spoke, the more she realized that she was beginning to see him not just as a boss, but as a person. And that person, despite his past, despite the empire he had built on fear and respect, was someone who genuinely wanted to do better. He was not perfect, but he was trying. And for Maria, that was enough. One evening, as they sat in his office once again, the atmosphere between them was different. There was no longer the tension that had once filled the room. Now, it was replaced by something more comfortable, more familiar. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I'm not done yet. But I promise you this, the changes I've made here will last. And I'll make sure of it." She looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "I believe you," she said quietly. And in that moment, she realized that, for the first time, she truly did. The following days felt like the calm after a storm. The changes that had started to take shape in the mansion had begun to solidify, and Maria found herself caught in the whirlwind of a new life that was slowly unfolding around her. The air felt different now, lighter, more relaxed, and she noticed the subtle shift in the way the staff carried themselves. They spoke with more confidence, less fear in their eyes, less hesitation when addressing the Mafia boss. He had done more than just give them better working conditions. He had given them a sense of worth. But despite all the progress, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of unease that still lingered within her. It wasn't the kind of unease that came from being afraid. It was the kind that made her question everything, including herself. Was she ready for all of this? Could she truly embrace the change that was happening? The respect that the Mafia boss had promised her, the place at the table, was something she had never dreamed of. And now, it was real. It was hers. But the weight of it was heavy. She wasn't sure how to navigate it. Her role had always been so clear before. She had been the maid, the one who stayed in the background, who obeyed the rules. But now, she was expected to lead, to guide, to help bring about the very change she had once thought was impossible. That evening, as she walked through the hallways of the mansion, she saw him again. The Mafia boss was standing by the window in his study, staring out into the night, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't notice her approach, but as she neared, he turned, his expression unreadable. "Maria," he said, his voice steady. "There's something I need to tell you." She stopped in her tracks, her heart beating faster. She wasn't sure what this conversation was going to be about, but she could sense that it was important. "What is it, sir?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of uncertainty. He stepped closer to her, his gaze piercing yet soft, as if he were searching for something in her. "I've been thinking about how far we've come," he began, his voice low. "About everything that's changed. And about the path ahead? Maria nodded, not sure how to respond. We've made progress. Yes, he continued, his tone serious. But there's still much more to do. I need you to help me keep things on track. I need you to keep reminding me of what we've worked for. The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. She had already been doing so much, helping with the changes, supporting the staff, but now, he was asking her for even more. He wanted her to be his guide, his reminder of the mission they were on. She had never imagined she would be in this position, never thought she would be standing here, speaking with the Mafia Boss as an equal. Of course, she said, her voice steady despite the flurry of emotions running through her. I'll do whatever it takes to help. He smiled faintly, a gesture that felt more genuine than anything she had seen from him before. I know you will, he said, his voice softening. You've done more than I could have asked for. And I trust you. I trust you to keep this house moving in the right direction. Maria felt a swell of pride in her chest at his words. He trusted her, not just as a servant, not just as an employee, but as someone whose judgment mattered. The realization was overwhelming, but it also filled her with a newfound sense of purpose. Thank you, she said quietly, not knowing what else to add. He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. You've earned it, Maria, he said. I couldn't have made these changes without you. The weight of his words settled on her shoulders, but it was a weight she was starting to feel capable of carrying. This wasn't just about serving anymore. This was about leading, about making decisions, about helping others see the world differently. As she left his study that evening, Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Everything had changed. But it wasn't just the mansion that had transformed. It was her, too. She was no longer the woman who hid in the background, afraid to speak up, afraid to be noticed. She was someone who had a voice, who had a place in this world. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but for the first time, Maria felt ready to face it. The path ahead might be difficult, but she wasn't alone. She had the trust of the Mafia Boss, and she had the respect of the people around her. And as she walked down the hall, she couldn't help but smile. She was finally on her way to becoming the person she had always wanted to be. Maria had always believed that people, especially those in power, never changed. She had spent years working under the Mafia Boss's rule, watching from the shadows as the world around her remained constant, unyielding. But now, everything was different. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to shift whenever she entered a room. The mansion, once cold and intimidating, now felt like a place where change was not only possible, but happening every day. The staff was more confident, the atmosphere more relaxed, and for the first time in a long time, Maria allowed herself to believe that this was not just a temporary phase. The changes were real. As the weeks passed, Maria found herself taking on more responsibility, something she never imagined would happen. She had been asked to oversee the staff, to help implement the new values that the Mafia Boss was trying to instill. She had become the voice of reason, the one everyone turned to for guidance. But with this new responsibility came a weight that she had never felt before. Every decision she made now had an impact. Every word she said carried more weight than it ever had. And with that weight came a new sense of pressure to ensure that the changes were truly permanent. One evening, as Maria sat in the kitchen reviewing the staff's performance, she heard footsteps approaching. It was him again, the Mafia Boss. He had been quietly watching her over the past few weeks, always just out of sight, but always present. She knew he was observing, making sure that she was up to the task. And while she wasn't afraid of him anymore, she couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous anticipation whenever he was near. Maria, he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something else in it, something softer. She looked up from the papers in front of her, meeting his gaze. Yes, sir, she asked, her heart beating a little faster. I've been watching you, he said, stepping into the room. And I've been impressed. Maria blinked, surprised by his words. She had worked hard, but she hadn't expected him to notice, let alone acknowledge it. Thank you, sir, she replied, unsure of how to respond. You've done more than I could have hoped for, he continued, his voice softer now, more genuine. You've taken on more responsibility than I ever thought you would, and you're handling it well. He paused for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. But there's something I need to tell you, Maria. Her heart skipped a beat. She had learned not to assume anything when it came to him. What is it, sir? She asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm still not used to this whole change. It's not easy for me, he admitted, his voice low. But seeing how you've stepped up, how you've handled everything with such grace, it's made me realize something. Maria waited, unsure of where this was going. What is it? She asked softly. You're not just the help anymore, he said, his words carefully chosen. You're not just a maid or an employee. You're someone who matters, Maria. You're part of this family, whether you want to be or not. And I need you to understand that. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected him to say anything like that. She had always been so invisible to him, so insignificant. But now, in this moment, he was telling her that she mattered. She wasn't sure how to process it. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He gave a small nod, his expression softening. I don't say this often, but you've earned my respect, Maria. And I want you to know that I'm proud of the work you've done. His words, so simple, yet so powerful, filled her with a sense of accomplishment she had never known. She had never expected this kind of recognition, especially not from him. I've always just done my job, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, he replied, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But you've done more than just your job. You've changed things here. You've helped bring about the changes I never thought were possible. She looked at him, unsure of how to respond, but feeling a deep sense of pride. I couldn't have done it without you, she said quietly. You're the one who started all of this. He shook his head, the smile fading slightly. It's not just me, Maria. It's all of us. We're in this together. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. He was right, of course. It hadn't just been him who had made the changes. It had been everyone, Maria included. She had helped lead them all into this new chapter, this new way of thinking. And for the first time, she realized that this was just the beginning. They weren't done yet. The changes would continue, and Maria would be there to help guide them every step of the way. We've come a long way, she said, her voice steady. But there's still work to do. He smiled, nodding. I couldn't have said it better myself. And as she stood there, looking at him, no longer the man who had once been so distant, but someone she now saw as a partner, a mentor, even a friend, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't just part of a system anymore. She was part of something real, something that mattered. And for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. The transformation in the mansion was undeniable. The once rigid and cold house had become a place where change was not only welcomed but expected. The Mafia Boss had kept his word. He had made sure that everyone in the house was treated with respect, not just Maria, but everyone. The staff no longer moved through the halls in silence, looking over their shoulders, fearful of the next order. They were now allowed to express their thoughts, their ideas, and even their concerns. Maria, having played a crucial part in helping to implement these changes, had found herself in a position she never dreamed of. She had gone from being invisible to someone whose opinion mattered, whose voice was heard. The relationship between her and the Mafia Boss had evolved as well. What had started as an uneasy truce, rooted in necessity, had slowly grown into something more. They no longer interacted as employer and employee, but as equals, partners in something they both believed in, change. But despite all the progress, Maria still found herself facing moments of doubt. She had been given so much, more than she had ever expected, yet there were times when she questioned if she was truly ready for everything that came with this new life. Could she really lead? Could she be the person the staff saw her as now? Was she capable of making the right decisions? These questions swirled in her mind, but as she spent more time with the Mafia Boss, she began to understand something. He, too, was still learning. He had once been a man driven by power, by control, but now, he was discovering the importance of trust and respect. And Maria was part of that journey. The trust he had placed in her wasn't just a gesture. It was a commitment, a shared responsibility. One evening, as she stood in the dining room overseeing the dinner preparations, she saw him walking toward her, his footsteps steady but purposeful. He had changed so much in such a short time, but there was still something about him that made Maria feel nervous whenever he was near. But tonight, as their eyes met, she saw something new. There was no tension, no distance. There was only mutual respect. Maria, he said, his voice calm. yet there was a warmth in it that she hadn't noticed before. I wanted to speak to you about something. She looked up, unsure of what to expect. What is it, sir? She asked, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. I've been thinking about everything we've accomplished here, he began, his tone quieter now. And I realized something. The changes I've made, the things I've tried to teach the others, they aren't just about the mansion. They're about me. About who I want to be. And I think you've played a bigger part in that than you realize. Maria blinked, caught off guard by his words. She had always known that his transformation had to start with him, but hearing him admit it aloud was something else entirely. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, stepping closer. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know how much this all means to me. You've helped me see things differently. You've helped me become a better man. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Maria felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just the Mafia boss, the man who had once seemed untouchable, unreachable. This was someone who had changed, someone who had let go of his old ways and was willing to build something better. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that was all anyone could ask for. I've seen you grow too, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. We've all seen it. And I'm proud of you. The words came from a place of honesty, from a place of understanding. They had both changed, him as a leader, and her as a person who had found her own voice. We've come a long way, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And we're just getting started. Maria nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't always going to be easy. Change never was. But for the first time, she truly believed in the path they were on. She believed in him. And more importantly, she believed in herself. As the evening went on, the staff gathered in the dining room, their laughter filling the air, the sounds of people coming together as equals. The Mafia boss sat at the head of the table, and for the first time in Maria's life, it didn't feel like a throne of power. It felt like a seat of understanding. She joined him at the table, her seat no longer at the back of the room, but right there beside him. The feeling of being part of something larger, something good, settled into her chest. The future was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. With him, with the staff, and with herself, Maria knew she was ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer just the maid. She was someone who mattered. And this was just the beginning. Immerse yourself in this captivating tale of transformation and unexpected bonds, where the powerful Mafia boss begins to change his ways, leading to an unexpected connection with his maid. As Maria navigates a world of power and vulnerability, she discovers not only her own strength, but also the power of trust and change in an environment that once felt like a prison. Romance stories often delve into the complexities of relationships and personal growth, and this one is no exception. It explores the delicate balance of power, respect, and love, showing that even the most hardened hearts can soften. As Maria and the Mafia boss move through their journey of self-discovery and mutual respect, they uncover what it truly means to change and be changed. These romance stories illustrate how emotional growth and personal transformation can be as powerful as any romance, creating a deeper connection between two seemingly opposite individuals. The evolving relationship between the two characters reminds us that love can blossom in the most unlikely of places, proving that sometimes it's not about who you are, but who you become together. For anyone who loves a heartfelt romance, this story is a perfect reminder that transformation is key to the most powerful of connections, something that resonates deeply within the heart of romance stories.